Hello, welcome to the Tuesday edition of Bible Story Children's Time. Glad you could make it to join us. I've got stuff you have probably never heard today. So I hope you're ready to have your horizons broadened a little bit. So today we are going to continue talking about the early days of Jesus' ministry. And again, we are pulling from the Gospel of Luke, which is where we've been for the last few days. And if you remember, yesterday, Jesus called the first four of his apostles, Peter and his brother, and James and John, sons of Zebedee. They were all fishermen. And Jesus recruited them to be fishers of people, or fishers of men, as it says in the original interpretation. Now that's broadened out to be fishers of people, because they were looking for anybody, all genders. So, after that recruitment, Jesus was continuing to go through the towns. He was continuing to cast out the occasional demon, continuing to do signs and wonders. And then, in one particular town, something very special happened. A man came along who was covered with what Luke calls leprosy. The word here, the Greek word that's used to be interpreted as leprosy, can also mean a variety of other disfiguring skin diseases. So we're not exactly sure if it was leprosy the way we think of it today, which is called Hansen's disease, or if it was just some other dread skin disease. Whatever it was, this guy had it, and he had it bad. And when Jesus came to town, this guy went over and he fell on his face in front of Jesus, and he begged him. He said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." So a couple of things happening here. One, this man was acknowledging Jesus as Lord. Number two, this man trusted that Jesus' power, wherever it came from, was such that he would be able to heal his leprosy. So Jesus reached out and he touched the man, which normally an observant Jew would not do back in first century, because this man was considered unclean. So by reaching out and touching him, Jesus risked also becoming unclean. But he reached out, he touched him, he made contact, he made human contact with this diseased, cast out from society, cast off. And Jesus said, "I am willing." Then he said, "Be clean." And immediately, Luke says, the leprosy went away. The disfiguring skin disease, whatever it was, went away. And this is every bit as miraculous as casting out a demon or anything like that. And the man was astonished. Those around were astonished as well. And then Jesus did something curious. He said, "Don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing, as a testimony to them." So what did he mean? And it turns out, did some research into this. When you were cleansed of a disease like this, there was a process that you had to go through to be declared officially cleansed. officially healed. This was because these diseases that disfigured the skin, that were all kind of lumped in as leprosy, they made you unclean. And if you were unclean, you were not allowed to be among people. You were cast out. You were sent away. You had to live outside the village or wherever you had lived before. And this all goes back to what we call the Old Testament, what Jesus and his people would have just called the Bible, the Hebrew Testament. And in the book of Leviticus, there are 2 chapters, a total of 91 verses devoted to leprosy, diseases, to disfiguring diseases of the skin, and what needed to be done about them. And this opens up with the Lord telling Moses, when anyone has a swelling or a rash or a shiny spot on their skin that may be a defiling skin disease, they must be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons who is a priest. Now, this was back, in the days when they were in the Sinai. Aaron was the chief priest. He was Moses' spokesman, but he was also the chief priest. This has passed on generation after generation after generation for over 1,000 years to get to Jesus' time. So you have a whole class of priests that serve at the temple. And these are the ones, they're Aaron's descendants, both spiritually and actually genetically. And these are the ones who are the priests that are in charge of maintaining religion, in a sense. They're the ones who are in charge of completing rituals that need to be completed and doing all of the things that God commanded. And the priest would then examine you if you were suspicious or suspected of having something. You present yourself to the priest, they look you over, and again, there's 91 verses of this, so there's a lot of detail about what they're looking for. And every one of them ends with the words, if the priest sees something, it says, he shall pronounce them unclean, it is a defiling skin disease. That phrase appears many, many, many times. Paired with that is also the phrase, the priest shall pronounce them unclean. So, remember I mentioned Jesus wouldn't have touched this man because just touching him also made Jesus unclean. Or it should have. Now, what does this mean? Leviticus spells it out in chapter 13, verse 46. Anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of their face and cry out, unclean, unclean. As long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone and they must live outside the camp. This was written, remember, when the Israelites were in the Sinai, when they were not in a permanent location, they were always in a camp. Once they made it to Canaan and they were in towns and villages, then that got updated so that the unclean would have to live outside the town. They were not allowed to come in. They were not allowed to participate in normal human activities. In many ways, they were like dead to society. And it was an awful thing when this happened. And you can imagine if somebody has a disease and he's had it for a while, you can imagine what kind of psychological toll that takes on him. And they're willing to do anything just to maybe get healed so they can go back and become a part of society again. And this is part of what Jesus was here for. Jesus came to show, among other things, to show God's grace and God's forgiveness, and to reunite and reconnect with people. So the idea that Jesus would willingly reach out to this outcast, any outcast who has leprosy and is unclean, is very fitting. So, now Jesus has reached out, he's healed him. And then he says, don't tell anybody. So there's lots of reasons for that. Part of it might have been he just didn't want to make people, he didn't want to peak too early, basically. He didn't want people thinking that he was a major prophet, or that he might even be some supernatural figure at this point in his ministry. He wanted people to be listening to his words. And if they're thinking, oh my gosh, this is somebody very, very special, they're not necessarily going to be thinking about what he's saying as much as just thinking about who he is, what he's doing, and what can he do for me. Also, it's been suggested that this is really just a really good marketing tool. Because, if you tell somebody not to say something, their natural inclination is to say something. And if you tell a neighbor, hey, guess what? I was healed by this guy, but keep it quiet. That's like surefire going to spread. So, depends on how worldly you want to think Jesus was at that point. But then he told him he had to go and present himself to the priest to be declared clean. What does that involve? That's chapter 14. There's 32 verses describing this process. I'll give you the short version. The guy goes to the priest, says, hey, look, all gone. The priest has to examine the person who claims to be healed. And they have to do this outside of town. Because this stuff is contagious. In their eyes, it's very contagious. They don't want to risk people contracting it. We can really connect with this today with COVID. But this person has to stay outside. So the priest goes to see them. And they examine. And if the priest determines that they were healed of their disfiguring or defiling skin disease, the priest orders that 2 live birds, clean birds, and some cedar wood, some scarlet yarn, and some hyssop reeds be brought for the person who was cleansed. And you're thinking, oh, that's a lot of interesting stuff. What would all that be used for? Well, the bad news is it's not good for one of the birds. Because the person who did the healing, or who was healed rather, kills one of the birds over some fresh water in a clay pot. So the blood goes into the pot. Then takes the live bird, dips it in the blood, together with the cedar wood, the scarlet yarn, and the reeds, and you dip it in this 7 times. And then that bird gets released into the open field. It lives to tell the story. After this, the person who was cleansed must wash all of their clothes, shave off all of their hair, and then bathe with water so that they are ceremonially clean. After this, they can come into town, but they can't enter any building for 7 days. On the 7th day, they must shave off all their hair again. You don't want that stubble. And it specifies they must shave their head, their beard, their eyebrows, and the rest of their hair. They must wash their clothes again, bathe themselves in water, and on the 8th day, they must bring 2 male lambs and 1 ewe lamb, a year old, each without defect, along with flour and oil. And then, once again, not good for the lambs. Lambs are sacrificed. And the priest takes some of the blood from that offering and they put it on the lobe of the right ear of the person who's being cleansed, on the thumb of their right hand, and on the big toe of the right foot. And then the priest takes the oil, pours it into the palm of his hand, dips the forefinger into the palm, and sprinkles it 7 times on the sacrifice, and then takes the oil, puts it on the right ear, the right big toe, and on top of the blood of the offering. And then the rest of the oil gets poured on the guy's head, or the person's head. So all this happens before the person is considered clean. And once they've done all that, they are welcomed back into society. Which is good news for them, but it's a big process to go through. And the interesting thing is, after this incident with the guy healed from leprosy, something else happens with somebody else who's unclean. And that person is a tax collector named Levi. Now, not unlike a leper, tax collectors were considered unclean and nobody would want to be in contact with them. Nobody would want to certainly eat with them. Nobody would want to have anything to do with them because they're scum of the earth and unclean. And yet Jesus sought this man out, Levi, and called him over and said, "Follow me." Just like he had done with the fisherman. And Levi did so. And then Levi invited Jesus to come to a banquet at his house, and he went. So Jesus was showing, I don't care if this guy is unclean. I don't care if you think this guy is unclean. I'm going to reach out to him anyway. And when some people said, why are you socializing with tax collectors and other sinners? Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need doctors. It's the sick. This is where I'm going. I've not come to call the righteous, but to call sinners to repentance. And right there, Jesus is laying down the framework for his ministry. Up to that point, it's just been signs and wonders and preaching and stuff like that. But right here, he starts to define really what he's doing, why he's here. He starts to define how he is going to show people the kingdom of God. And that's where we're ending our story today. So I hope you have a great evening. Stay healthy. And we'll see you here tomorrow on Wednesday, 5 o'clock. Take care.